and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to continue our unit on classical Greece really by bringing the unit to an end. When we talk about Alexander the Great, we're going to really look at the end of not only the Greek civilization, but also the Persians. And it's not that these two civilizations are wiped out, but more so that they're brought together through something called Hellenism. So our total story here is going to be Alexander the Great and Hellenistic culture. We have one constructive response question we're going to be able to answer after this today. It says trace the development of Alexander the Great and his accomplishments. And we'll do just that. We'll be able to see kind of his rise and his fall, and we'll look at really what that meant for the people in the area, as well as why that's such a big accomplishment for Alexander, this giant empire that he creates, because he conquers a lot of land, as you're going to find out. What are we going to learn? Well, here's our roadmap, as we always look at. We'll start with Alexander's father, Philip II, because he really gets this story started. So we'll look at Philip II and how he conquers Greece. We'll look at how Alexander conquers Persia, and we will end with talking about this idea of Hellenism, which is one of your vocab words, as well as a blending of cultures that we will see that takes place as a result of Alexander and Philip. So that's where we're going with all of this. Setting the stage, we have to understand a little bit of geography here, because Macedonia is a piece of property we haven't really talked much about this unit. I had you label it on your map assignment, and I like to refer to it as Greece's Canada. I mean, for us, we always know Canada is just north of us. We don't think of them too often. We're not worried about them. They don't typically pose any threat to us. And I think for the Greeks, that's really what Macedonia was for them. So Macedonia is located north of Greece. Macedonia, like Greece, had a rough terrain and a little bit cooler climate, which would make sense because as you go north on latitude, you're just going to run into cooler weather. Further north you go, the closer you get to the North Pole, of course, it's going to get colder. Now, I'm not talking like 30, 40 degrees cooler, but it's, a few degrees cooler than what the Greeks had for sure. The people in Macedonia lived in mountain villages instead of city-states. They were not as advanced as the Greeks. They did not have anything like Athens or Sparta. And many Macedonians actually thought of themselves as Greeks because they'd absorbed a lot of Greek culture, some of the Greek gods, some of them spoke Greek, so there was a lot in common there. But if you had asked the Greeks, that's not the way they would have seen it. So the Greeks actually looked down upon the Macedonians as uncivilized foreigners. And you've seen that as a theme throughout this semester. People who tend to think highly of themselves tend to think lower of everybody else. We've seen it. The Mongols certainly thought it. The Chinese thought it. Here we have the Greeks thinking it. If you're not one of us, you're not as good, is the idea. And so the Macedonians were not seen as Greeks, even though that's how they felt. That's what they felt about themselves. All right, let's start with Philip II of Macedonia. Philip became king of Macedonia in 359 BC at age 23. He does lose an eye in battle, as you saw in the previous image. And his claim to fame is really going to be about his military. Philip trained the rugged peasants in Macedonia and turned them into a very professional army, which consisted of a few important changes that we really haven't talked about yet in warfare. Those who can pioneer new tactics, new weapons, things like that, typically do pretty well in history. So what Philip does is he makes the phalanx formation even bigger. Typically a phalanx formation, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. We saw that at the Battle of Thermopylae. We saw that at the Battle of Marathon. Typically it's an 8-man deep phalanx. So you have 8 rows of 8 men. Well, he doubles that, 16 by 16, which of course is going to make your phalanx even stronger. Second thing he does is he arms each soldier with an 18-foot pike. Now that's significant because it's a weapon. A pike has a spike at the end. You can use that to kill. But in a lot of ways, it was more used to push the enemy back. And if you can push the enemy back, always kind of keep them on the defensive. It gives you a huge advantage because you can push forward. Then you can drop your pike, or you can send in other infantry or cavalry. Infantry or men with or soldiers with shields and spears, and cavalry are men on horseback. You can use your phalanx with the pikes to push them back, and then send in your infantry or cavalry, and you can do a lot of damage that way. So he sent in his fast-moving cavalry or soldiers on horseback, and he could devastate the enemy quite quickly. Now, Philip really, really liked Greece. If you've seen Alexander Engineering an Empire, and most of you have by this point, Peter Weller talks about how Philip didn't want to destroy Greece. He wanted to be Greece. And so Greece to him was like a prize that he wanted to own because he wanted to be a part of it. So Philip invades Greece, but not to destroy or enslave the Greeks. That's important for us to understand, because a lot of times we see that in history. Conquerors want to conquer because it's who they are. It's what they want to do. They want more land and they want to enslave the people. They're ruthless leaders. And that's not the case here. It's all about trying to score a piece of property that you covet very much. Here's a picture of the Pikes. Again, as you can see here, 18 feet. It really does make a difference. The problem is, because of the length of it, you need both arms to hold it. So you're not able to carry a shield. So it does make you susceptible to arrows, bow and arrow fire. But if you march quick enough, and I think a pike would be fairly light enough that you can move pretty quickly with this type of phalanx formation, that you could certainly move that invading or conquering army, or whoever it is that you're fighting, you can move them back pretty quickly. All right, Philip goes to battle at something called the Battle of Caronia. And he's going to fight a couple of different Greek city-states here, Athens and Thebes being two of them, because they're seeing him as a threat. So Athens and Thebes joined forces to fight Philip's army. But with the pikes, with the 16 by 16 phalanx, Philip's army is too powerful and he defeats the Greeks. What's really, really fascinating about this point is this is the end of Greek independence. The Greeks had fought the Persians in the Persian Wars and had pushed the Persians out at the Battle of Salamis. They were never taken over by the Persians. And in a lot of ways, they probably should have been, because the Persian army was just that big. But they, with guts and fighting skills, they were able to push those Persians out of town. Well, they don't do that here with Philip. So Philip, by winning the Battle of Caronia, he takes over Greece. We want to take a look at a definitive point in history where a civilization ends. Doesn't mean they die out. It means they are now absorbed into something else. They're now absorbed into Philip's Macedonian Empire. This is the end of the Greeks. They're never going to have their independence back. The city-states that ruled themselves are no longer ruling themselves. You have one person in control, and that, of course, is Philip. Now, Philip then sets his sights on the superpower at the time. The Persians are still a big deal. Even though they lost to the Greeks at Salamis, they're still a big deal. So Philip next sets out to defeat the mighty Persian Empire. But he's not going to do it. Why? Because Philip is stabbed to death in 336 BC at his daughter's wedding. No one's totally sure exactly what happened. The assassin himself was run down almost immediately and just destroyed by Philip's bodyguards. So there was really no way to understand exactly who he was working for or what his motivation was to actually kill Philip. But of course, by killing Philip, now you have a power vacuum. You need someone who's in charge. And typically in these situations, it goes to the eldest son, which of course is going to be Alexander. Now, I should mention there is a film on Alexander the Great made by Oliver Stone. It's good. It's not amazing, but there's some cool parts of this story, both Philip and Alexander, that I'm going to tell you today that are depicted in the film. Film's told out of order. It's not told from start to finish. They kind of take a little different route and how they want to tell that story. But the reason I'm mentioning it here is it is a decent look at Alexander's life if you're interested in looking at Philip and Alexander. Colin Farrell plays Alexander the Great. So let's take a look at who Alexander the Great was and what he's going to do with his power. So, background on Alexander. Well, he's 20 years old when Philip is stabbed. So he takes over at age 20 after the death of his father, Philip II. This is probably a good point for me to remind you in the event that I'm going too fast or you don't catch something. Always feel free to pause and rewind and get what you need. Alexander was the pupil of a very famous philosopher, Aristotle. So he's taught by Aristotle, and by the time he's age 20, he's learned all sorts of things. I mean, he's a very educated person. He learned science, he learned geography, he learned literature, philosophy, definitely trained in the art of war, not only fighting with his father, who he didn't really get along with all that well. I should say that. Philip and Alexander didn't have the best relationship, but he was trained well enough so that once he takes control of the army, he's going to be the right man for the job, essentially. We know that Alexander enjoyed Homer's description of the heroic deeds of Achilles during the Trojan Wars, and why that's significant is it shows us that, some of us look up to, like a LeBron James or an Adrian, well, maybe not so much Adrian Peterson anymore, but sometimes we have our own, sports legends that we look up to. Well, they didn't have that back then. So if you wanted to look up to somebody as a warrior, you looked at the literature that was out there, and certainly Achilles, being the best of the best for the Greeks during the Trojan Wars, would have been somebody Alexander would have admired. Now, in order to legitimize his power, Alexander killed 6,000 Thebans in a rebellion. There was some contention to who was going to rule. The Thebans thought they could maybe take Greece back, and this amount of cruelty frightened the Greeks into accepting Alexander as their leader. But I don't want you to sit around and say, well, Alexander just went and slaughtered people just so they'd like him or that they'd take him serious. This is sort of a one-time deal. That's not who Alexander was. How Alexander defeats the Persians? Well, he is going to defeat the Persian Empire. Philip wanted to conquer Persia, but he never had the chance. Alexander takes 35,000 troops into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and he's going to hit the Persian Empire head on. So he's going to meet 40,000 Persians at the Battle of Granicus River. And Alexander's army attacks first. He breaks through the enemy lines, he uses his cavalry, he uses his phalanx properly, and he is victorious. This is a pretty close fight, 35,000 to 40,000. He's not that outnumbered here, but it's his tactics that win this battle. Being able to go quickly, break through the Persians, was definitely, well planned and well executed. And by doing so, we're going to see a response by Darius III. Darius III responds with an army of 50,000 to 75,000. So now he's got Alexander beat 2-1. Well, again, the Macedonians break through the weak point of Darius's army. Darius sees the writing on the wall and he runs away. He flees. And because of this, Alexander has control of Anatolia. He's got one piece of the Persian Empire, and he's going to continue after that. We're going to end part 1 right here. So go ahead and please play part 2 and continue on with Alexander the Great.